It's the 3310th year of the Second Age. The greatest kingdom of men to ever exist is on the brink of destruction. Ar-Pharazôn, the king of Numenor, the most terrible tyrant of men, has foolishly decided to make war upon the Valar, the greatest spirits in Arda. Being misled by Sauron, the king falsely believes that the land of Aman grants immortality. While most of the Númenóreans has fallen under a shadow, rebellious to the west, not all are yet deceived by Sauron. The Elendili, the faithful Númenóreans, remain loyal to the councils of the Valar, and they have kept their friendship with the Elves. Amandil, the Lord of the Faithful, sails in secret to the west to plead the Valar for mercy, sacrificing himself to save his people from the upcoming disaster. After the advice of his father, Elendil secretly prepares his people for a voyage to Middle-earth. Eventually, the day came when Ar-Pharazôn raised the greatest armada ever seen, and he went aboard and sailed towards Aman. But when the king of Numenor set foot in the Blessed Realm and laid claim to the land of the Valar, Eru, the One, intervened, and the king's army was buried beneath the hills, and Numenor was thrown down and swallowed in the sea. But the faithful Númenóreans survived, for Elendil and his people had refused Ar-Pharazôn's summon and had instead sailed east towards Middle-earth. The faithful established what became known as the Kingdoms in Exile, for Elendil founded the Kingdom of Arnor in the north, while his sons Isildur and Anarion founded the Kingdom of Gondor in the south. Other Númenóreans survived also, for many persecuted Elendili had sailed to Middle-earth before the downfall, and they lived now in the ancient haven of Pelargir and the stronghold which would later become known as Dol Amroth. The Númenóreans built many strong places, and they had brought with them treasures and heirlooms of great virtue and wonder. For a time, the kingdoms in exile prospered, but then came the day when smoke rose from Orodruin, and the Dunedain perceived that the Dark Lord Sauron had returned to his fortress of Barad-dur. Ever since the downfall of Numenor, it was believed that Sauron had perished, for he was present at the Isle of Helena when it was swallowed by the Belegair. Sauron had lost his physical shape in the downfall, but as a Maya spirit, he took the shape of an evil wind and fled to Mordor in secret. There he waited, and took a new terrible shape, an image of hatred and malice made visible. When Sauron learned that the faithful had survived, he was filled with wrath, and he now called upon arms to destroy the Dunedain once and for all. Many servants he had in the east and south, and among them were not few of the Númenórean race, for many Númenóreans had settled in Haradhwaith and fell under a shadow. The peoples of the east and south answered Sauron's call, and at last he unleashed his great force. Minas Ithil, the city of Isildur, was besieged. Little is known about this assault, but the attack must have been sudden, and it likely caught Isildur's forces by surprise. The servants of Sauron captured the city, and they burned the White Tree, a great Númenórean heirloom. But Isildur escaped the assault, brought with him a seedling of the White Tree, and sailed northward, seeking aid from Elendil. But Sauron did not halt the assault, and his forces headed at once for Osgiliath and Minas Anor. But Anarion was prepared now, and the Númenóreans gave the attackers a stiff resistance. The servants of Sauron managed not to break through the defenses, and Anarion's forces rallied. The evil men were routed, and retreated to Minas Ithil, regathering strength. But Anarion knew that the kingdom of Gondor would fall, unless help should come to his kingdom. Simultaneously, a council was held in the north, and Elendil and Isildur spoke with their ally, the High King of the Noldor, Gil-galad. They perceived that Sauron would grow too strong and overcome his enemies one by one if they did not all unite against him, and therefore they made a league which is called the Last Alliance. Elendil mustered his forces, and at the great watchtower of Amun-Sul he watched the coming of Gil-galad and Círdan, and the forces of Lindon. And Elendil and Gil-galad marched east to Imladris, combining forces with Elrond, and they summoned all folk to their aid. It is said that the host that was there assembled was fairer and more splendid in arms than any that has since been seen in Middle-earth. From Imladris they crossed the misty mountains by many passes, and marched down along the Anduin. Sauron had sent out such orc troops as he could spare, to assault the host when it crossed the mountains. But the orcs hid, filled with terror, for the might of their enemies were very great. The host crossed the Anduin, and marched south towards the Black Land, and their strength was ever increased, for they were joined by many peoples. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm, the elves of Lorinand, and of Greenwood the Great, and the men of the Wales, all joined the League of the Last Alliance. While advancing southwards, the host entered a desolate land, an area victim to Sauron's scorched earth policy. This land had once housed the beautiful gardens of the Entwives, but all was now in ruin. At last, the host reached the plain that bordered the Black Land, and here they witnessed Sauron's host in the distance. Thousands upon thousands were gathered on either side, ready to fight for the fate of Middle-earth. From this point on, we know little of how the war occurred, thus, assumptions must be drawn, based on Tolkien's vague descriptions. Sauron's host assumably consisted of orcs, trolls, black Númenóreans, Haradrim, Easterlings, and other evil creatures. Sauron were likely present on the field, wielding the One Ring, to increase the potency of his host. The Nazgûl could have proved to be subordinate commanders, since they were completely subservient to the will of Sauron. But the Alliance fielded redoubtable warriors. Noldor lords from the utmost west, Númenóreans with dreaded steel bows, grim dwarves clad in mithril, and other hardy and valiant folk. Gil-galad were in charge of the Alliance, and the other peoples were assumably commanded by their respective kings. The two opposing forces now prepared their lines for the great battle. Then, suddenly, a great horn rang, and the host of these surged forward with a terrible cry. But Elrond Half-Elven, herald of Gil-galad, sounded his horn in return. Thousands of arrows let loose, and rained down upon their enemies like a hail tipped with iron. Sauron's forces quickly approached, and clashed with the defenders with terrible ferocity. Fierce fighting took place on all fronts. It soon became apparent that Amdir's army was cut off from the main host, driven in direction of the marshes, and King Amdir was slain. But the situation was different elsewhere, for the Númenóreans were strong and tall and terrible in their wrath, and against the Noldor lords few could stand. Sauron's servants were driven back by the stiff resistance, and they fell in the thousands. The host of these had already suffered great losses, and seeing the peril that his forces were in, Sauron ordered a retreat to the Black Gate. The Alliance drove their enemy forward, into Udun, but they could not pursue their enemies into Mordor, for the Black Gate was closed. Simultaneously, Anarion assumably retook Minas Ithil, and leaving behind a small defense, he headed north to join the assault on the Morannon. Having blocked the main entrances into Mordor, the Alliance now proceeded to the invasion of the Black Land. Gil-galad and his allies had made plans, but before the High King had given the signal for advance, King Oropher rushed forward at the head of his people. This was a grave mistake, and King Oropher and many of his people were slain before the gates of Mordor. But the lords of the Alliance now initiated their plans, and the force of the west assailed the Morannon. For months they fought, but Gil-galad and Elendil eventually managed to conquer the great fortification. Sauron's diminished host was forced to retreat to the very heart of his realm, Barad-dur. It was immeasurably strong, with its countless gargantuan towers, walls, and battlements. Both the west and the east gate only had one entrance, a bridge spanned over a great abyss. The Alliance faced their greatest challenge as of yet, and thus the siege of Barad-dur began. It was long and terrible, and the Alliance suffered grievous losses by fires and projectiles. Anarion and many others were slain from the reckless defense, and year after year they struggled against Sauron. Many sorties he led, and his ring drove his servants with malice. But at last the situation had become so dire that Sauron himself came forth and led one last desperate charge. The stationed attackers were swept away by this sudden assault, for the hatred of Sauron few could withstand. And then came the last battle, and the grimmest servants of Barad-dur clashed into the ranks of the Alliance. And here, at the slopes of Orodruin, Sauron fought with Gil-galad and Elendil. The very heat of Sauron's hand consumed Gil-galad, and Elendil also perished, but the High Kings managed to overthrow Sauron with Aeglos and Narsil. The last few servants of Sauron were filled with madness upon the seeming death of the Dark Lord, and they routed and died. The Nazgûl and the few remaining survivors fled east and was not seen for long centuries. The forces of Sauron had been defeated, and the Alliance had a victory, but it was fruitless, for Isildur cut the one ring of Sauron's finger and kept it for himself, against the counsels of Elrond and Círdan, and Sauron was allowed to endure. The Alliance had also suffered grievous casualties, and many kings, lords, and other fair folk had perished. A great part of the Elves sailed west after the war, weary with grief, and never again would there be any such league of elves and men. The Dúnedain was diminished, and it would set long-lasting marks on the kingdom of Arnor. But in the south, the realm of Gondor long endured, and for a while its splendor grew, recalling somewhat of the might of Numenor. Isildur returned to Gondor for a time, and proclaimed his sovereign lordship over all the Dúnedain. But he held a hidden malice, and great evil was yet to beset the world. If you are interested in lore from Tolkien's Legendarium, make sure to check out these videos right here. Remember to subscribe and consider supporting this channel by joining the YouTube membership, becoming a Patreon, or buying merchandise on Teespring.